We're all like, man.
I'm gonna fire on this. I'm gonna fire on this. You start adding nuts and icing and wheat germ and.
Hey everyone, good morning. Welcome to our work session of Committee on Council on the discussion of potentially dividing up community development and human services into separate committees. I am Liliana Bakhtiari, the chair of COC. To my left, I have Matt Westmoreland, Councilmember Matt Westmoreland, and Chair Jason Dozier, who is the current chair of CDHS. And to my right, I have my vice chair, Councilmember Amos. So first thing that we wanted to tackle in this discussion is what is considered community development and what is considered human services. So I think the best thing to do is starting with the actual breakdown of what the code says, go from there. Also, this is my first work session, so bear with me. All right, you're the expert, sir. So currently, let's see. Oh. Okay. So let's see. Currently, so Committee on Human Resources in the past, the code dictates we have Parks and Recreation, the Atlanta Public Library, Economic Opportunity Atlanta, the Neighborhood Program, Training Program, the list goes on. So my question to you, I also want to ask this of Councilmember Westmoreland, Councilmember Dozier. Councilmember Westmoreland as a previous chair and Councilmember Dozier as current chair, I wanted to ask what you all feel might be the highest, the most important pieces that fall within CDHS.
I'll take a stab at it. I would just say, I think that the community development piece, I mean, when we think about the comprehensive development plan, when you think about how much legislation is jointly referred between zoning committee and CDHS, I think that all fits into a bucket that is aligned in a way that is very separate from a lot of the other things that the committee oversees. Mm-hmm. I recognize in your description what was under CDHR back when that was the committee purview. Even like some of the things around Invest Atlanta, some of the things that we talk about with regards to housing and Atlanta Housing Authority, all those sorts of things I see as being in that CD bucket. But then, no donuts on camera. And then human services side, you mentioned Parks and Recreation. A lot of the work that we're doing with, even though it's tangentially related to housing, the homeless services that we work through as a city. We have several presentations from health departments, both Fulton County and DeKalb County health departments present before this committee. And so I see those sorts of kind of quality of life sorts of issues falling under that bucket. But I think, like I alluded to, I think there's some overlap. I mean, there's programming that is funded or supported through Invest Atlanta that is handled by other departments that overlap with some of the human services piece. So, yeah, that's kind of how I see it in my head. Just, I do think there's some things that even are outside of purview of this committee, like zoning, that there's an alignment there that makes things uniquely community development oriented. And so just something that is worth thinking about as we have this conversation.
And thank you for that. And may I ask also, what are the current committees that you sit on as chair?
As chair? Is that a trick question?
No, not as the District 4 council member.
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant I'm the CDHS chair.
What?
So by virtue of being the chair of the Community Development Human Services Committee, I serve on the board of Invest Atlanta. I serve on the board of Atlanta Beltline Incorporated. I serve on the board of the Continuum of Care Governing Council. I serve on the newly formed Atlanta Urban Development Corporation that had its kickoff board meeting yesterday. So those are the four that I serve on as by virtue of the CDHS role. So yeah, housing, economic development, and then specifically with the Beltline being a project specific area, and then homelessness. So those four kind of buckets.
And so one of the things that we also talked about was adding in, given, for example, given the fact that in the past, under human resources, when human services was considered human resources, there was also the conversation of one of the things that reporting to that committee was conventionism and tourism. So there was also the talk of potentially seeing if there was an opportunity to get onto the board of the Visitors Bureau as well. And if that would be the case, one of the reasons, like as we discussed that, because CDHS arguably is like one of our heaviest committees because of how much it covers, that if we were to split it, there'd be a divide of the committees that the chairs, there'd be a divide between those two committees. So one chair isn't having to sit on all of them, because I know that also these past 2 years, also as the District 4 council member, you also sit on additional boards as well. And that's the word I should have used, boards, not committees. So if we were to add that, that's another reason to think of, if we were to split these up, that would be less responsibility on a single chair.
And that's the irony, I think, with this, is that, yes, the CDHS committee has purview over a lot of different parts of our city, a lot of different governmental and quasi-governmental organizations that do work with the city. I serve on a lot of boards because of that oversight. But from a legislative standpoint, when it comes to legislative jurisdiction, there isn't, and this is where I'll let the staff tell me otherwise, the city staff tell me otherwise.
Here, sorry.
Thank you. I'll let the city staff tell me otherwise. But legislatively, I don't think the committee is overly burdened with the business of the city. It's just the extraneous work associated with the committee, being the presentations that we have. I think that takes up about two-thirds of our committee time every cycle, and then obviously the additional meetings that we have outside of that. So, but just from a legislative standpoint, there isn't an undue burden. So I think that definitely needs to be taken into consideration as well.
So, okay. Well, that's also one of the reasons that we're having this work session. So, because this initially, just to give the public and everyone in the room some background, given that this has been the year of the youth, and obviously everything starts with youth when it comes to safety issues, planning for the future, that is a foundational part of any city. So there was an understanding, I don't believe that we currently have youth development factored into any of our committees. So the idea was if we had youth development, where would you put it? To us, it felt like it would naturally fall under CDHS. Then there's also sustainability, which yes, currently in part reports to utilities, and that makes sense in terms of energy burden, but in terms of all the policy pieces we are attempting to do, and the fact that we've had record-breaking temperatures and are one of the top cities in the country for rapidly worsening air quality, amongst other issues when it comes to environmental, and that we now have a director of sustainability and resiliency for the mayor's office. It seemed it would be appropriate to also fold that in under CDHS as well. And so that is what kind of gave way to this idea of let's have a work session to discuss, because of the fact that it is one of our, it is a committee that does a lot of the city's work. So that is why I wanted to have both you and former Chair Westmoreland here, because you have, Matt, how long did you chair CDHS? 2 years, and you've chaired too. So the idea being, I wanted your expertise and for us to have the discussion on maybe we'd be able to do more, factor in more, be able to do more policy work if we were to split the two committees so it's not all in one area. And by virtue of that, having more council members involved in policymaking. So in terms of committees, currently you sit on 4. If we did, there'd be 5. And having youth development and sustainability folded in. Amber? Currently, what would be the process of adding additional committees onto, or I'm sorry, additional committees, and then also adding an additional board to one of the committees?
So, excuse me, Amber A. Robinson, City of Atlanta, Department of Law. There would be initially 2 sections of the City of Atlanta Code of Ordinances, which would immediately need to be amended. The first is 2-135. I'm sorry, the first is not 2-135. The first is 2-131, which is standing committees established, and lists out the current standing committees. There are currently 7 standing committees, and so that would need to be amended to add 1 new standing committee. And then there would be another code section which establishes the jurisdiction of each standing committee. That's 2-135. That would need to be amended to add the new standing committee and to set forth its jurisdiction. In the amendment to 2-135 is also where if you were to add a new subject matter to either a new standing committee or an existing standing committee, that would be the section of the City of Atlanta Code which would be amended to do so. Thereafter, after that initial work is done and the jurisdictions are separated or established with the new committee, a larger amount of work would need to be done, legislative work would need to be done, and this would all be appropriate for the same piece of legislation, to go through the entire code and identify every place where, in this case, CDHS is mentioned. And when you find those code sections, you determine whether or not it is mentioned based on the jurisdiction of the one new committee or the other new committee, and make the appropriate change to the language. So if one is more if it's mentioned in a place where now it would be the jurisdiction of, say, the Community Development Committee, then you would change that name in that other far-flung portion of code to reference the appropriate committee. And the same with the Human Services portion. So it's fairly simple. It could be a fairly thick piece of legislation, but that would that basically captures all of the legislative work that would be necessary.
And what is the, thank you, what is the minimum number of members on each committee currently required for a quorum? Is it 4 or 5? 4. Ms. Robinson's doing her typical furrowed brow look, so I'm going to give her a second to gather her thoughts. Okay. So, do you want to read that into the mic, sir? No. So, see, Westmoreland just whispered over here. No committee cannot have less than 5 or more than 7, and 4 is considered quorum.
And so I'm not going to disagree with that, but that makes sense. However, I don't think that that's a code requirement.
It is not a code requirement.
The size, but that is in keeping with the sizes of the committees that I've seen. Rules of council, I see.
So in the rules of council, so could you explain then, so if it's not currently written to the code, what does that mean in terms of rules of council?
So if something is in the rules of council, which the council has adopted pursuant to resolution, then the rules should be followed. However, they're not in a code, so they can be altered easily through a resolution or, frankly, a vote of, let's say, the full council, which happens, right, to suspend the rules during the full council meeting. It can happen right there because it's just adopted by resolution. Here, if the number of members of committee is set forth in the rules of council and you would like to change that, you could do so by a resolution,
Which would only
directing to
require 8
change the
votes
rules
rather
of
than 10.
council.
And that would only require 8 votes instead of 10, because it's not considered a charter amendment.
Well, none of this is a chart. So even the ordinance that I was speaking of, which would be necessary to change the code, that's not in the charter. That's in the code of ordinances. So only a simple ordinance would be needed in order to do that, which does not require any sort of supermajority or 3 reads or anything like that. It's 2 reads. It's a simple majority to do so. The difference is a resolution, in order to authorize the change in the rules of council, only requires 1 read, whereas an ordinance requires 2 reads by full council.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. That is very helpful. So I know that it would be up to the council president, who is on his way to speak to some of this, but the council president's discretion on how he would structure committees. And so for example, you would not need to have all 7 members. You do not need to have 7 members on every single committee. We could assign 5 members.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. So, because I know that there was, and I wanted to address that because there were some concerns by some council members that they would have to sit on multiple committees, more than up to 4, and some did not want to do that. So I want to make it very clear that the council president, if we were to move forward with the dividing of committees, would do a reassessment, talk to each colleague, and find out who wanted to sit on what committees and adjust membership on each of those committees accordingly. Either Councilmember Dozier or Westmoreland, for the idea of, given that your experience with CDHS, youth development being tied in. One of the things that we've talked about is the city partnering with counties, et cetera, like trying to do more around, and APS trying to do more around youth development, trying to find out how we bring more resources into the city, specifically to, for example, provide more opportunities for vulnerable youth. Obviously, we know that we're dealing with issues around violence, recruitment, kids that are getting targeted younger and younger. And so this is something that the mayor and that we have stressed as council is a very high priority to us. If youth development were to be folded in, because you said right now you don't feel that it is too burdensome, but if we were to fold in youth development, do you think that that would be too much for this one committee?
I would say no. Like I said, legislatively, that's if there's a funding package that's dual referred, that involves youth services or there's an agreement with Atlanta Public Schools, or like that sort of stuff. There's never, at least since I've been on this committee, haven't seen from a legislative standpoint anything like that be too burdensome. If there is, a much more, if you're the youth that gets operationalized as a department under or office under the mayor's office that has a reporting requirement for oversight purposes to this body, then that can create some challenges with our ability to have a presentation schedule set for the year. So that, like I say, it just depends on what aspect of that. But I will say, just kind of de facto, a lot of youth services and discussions around that are already coming through this committee, largely through the lens of Department of Parks and Recreation with the program that they have centered around Year to Youth. I feel like Commissioner Cutler has done several presentations to this body about what they're doing in support of Year of the Youth. Now, granted, Year to Youth is not the full all and all of how we're supporting young people across the city, but through, I feel like in several of the presentations we've received and some of the legislation that we've debated, we've talked about that as a topic. So it may not be spelled out in the city code, it may not be spelled out in the city charter, but I think just naturally that's where things have landed already. So I don't think explicitly spelling that out is going to create any undue burden for this committee, since we're already doing a lot of this work already.
Thank you. Vice Chair Amos, I wanted to ask you, because you're the current chair of the joint committee between APS and the City of Atlanta. And I see this as an opportunity. Doing something like folding in youth development might be an opportunity to give a stronger foundation and a greater platform to that joint committee. What are your thoughts?
I was sitting here thinking maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Maybe it's not so much about the current work, but the proposed added work. So if we were to hash out what the youth development or the sustainability committees would look like, then ask the question, would that additional work be too burdensome on the current committees that would help? The original resolution to create the joint committee came through CDHS. The current ones that we did where we added, the county commissioners came through, and that was quick to move forward. So like I say, the work, to me, the question is not about the current work, but more so the additional work that may be added. And we all can agree we can do a little bit better around youth services and how the city actually links with APS when it comes to our children and future residents of the city. But do they require another committee? Because as we add another committee, we're actually adding committee days as well that will actually fill up that committee week. So we have to look at that being done, and the amount of time that we're asking, not so much as me and my colleagues to serve on additional committees, but the amount of time it'll take to serve and having residents to come down and things of that nature as well. So
all valid points. No, thank you for that. That's actually a great point. And forgive me if I did this all in reverse. But I wanted to first temperature check and see what the ideas were. This is extremely helpful also for me in terms of learning what is possible. And one of the reasons I proposed there being, and one of the reasons I proposed there also being this added into a committee is because we are working to try to give this committee a stronger foundation. And the idea of it also being folded into one of our committees would actually place requirements on us and give us, and maybe hold us to those goals that we've laid out more effectively. But to your point, yes, you are correct. And so to give you an idea of what I'm thinking in terms of sustainability, we're currently in discussions of, Atlanta ranks, if we wanted to eradicate energy burden tomorrow in the city of Atlanta, it would cost us $400 million. And districts such as District 3, District 4, and we've been jointly also state that we've been joined by Councilmember Overstreet and Councilmember Winston, which I forgot to say earlier. Thank you both. Or like parts of District 1, parts of Councilmember Overstreet's district have higher rates of heat vulnerability and heat-related deaths. So, and this disproportionately affects specific areas of our city where people are lower income, majority minority neighborhoods, because we are not weatherizing properly. People, actually, energy burden currently is a leading cause of displacement in the city of Atlanta, which is why I thought it would be great to put more emphasis on that and have a report to CDHS for more of the policymaking piece. Because right now, I know Councilmember Winston, you chair utilities, and I believe sustainability currently reports to you. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we just recently added sustainability and resilience quarterly updates in the City Utilities Committee. I see as we have the clean energy goal of 2025 being 100% clean, to me it seems like it's a great fit long term, knowing that we could do more around the utilities aspect. We're doing more in terms of being able to, add more, solar energy throughout the city's infrastructure. And, I hope that we can continue to prop that up, in meeting our goal of 2025 of being 100% clean. And I think, it seems like a good fit being in city utilities and being able to kind of lean in there, to me seems to be a good fit going forward.
Okay, I appreciate that. And we've also been joined by Council President Shipman. Ms. Robinson, can I also ask, is it, do we currently require any of our not committees, but any of these organizations to dual report?
So whether or not they have to do a quarterly report to two committees, is that question? Or whether or not there are two committees that kind of have purview over matters that various outside organizations have jurisdiction over?
I would say the latter, because I'm pretty sure that I would be voted off the island by my colleagues if I required there to be the same quarterly report in more than one committee.
Right. So yes, I don't believe I'm aware of any department or organization that requires a quarterly report to more than one committee. However, there are definitely situations where there are departments as well as outside partners that come and present often and have matters before more than one committee. In my experience, I see that mostly with this CDHS and finance exec.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Bakhtiari and Councilmember Dozier for having this work session. I do have a few questions though, because oftentimes I speak about the role of the city and our distinct purview as opposed to other entities, Fulton County, APS. I just want to make sure, because those three entities in particular, we all have tax bases in the city of Atlanta. So our residents are all paying into buckets for each of our purviews in our own individual entities, right? And I just want to make sure that we are focusing on our tax-based purview, just to make sure that we're not adding more than what the city should take on, and that other entities are actually taking care of their base because they're getting paid to do that from taxpayers. And taxpayers are expecting them to do a good job in health and human services and some of these other things that are mentioned. Where land use is concerned and making sure that quality of life is perfect for our city of Atlanta residents, I'm going to be always all in. Just making sure that we are doing right by our citizens in city services and governing and things that we are responsible for as a city. Before we come to a place where we're actually dividing our committees, I want to make sure that we're not just doing what is good for right now. Because when I think about initiatives that were important to different administrations, sometimes I'm guided to think that, certain things are for just right now because this is something that's important right now. Right now, we do have a youth issue, And it's important that we focus on the youth, and it's going to take all of our tax bases to do that. It's going to take Fulton County, it's going to take Atlanta, it's going to take APS. I understand that. 10 years from now, is that where we're going to be? Is that going to be the initiative of our next mayor after Andre Dickens serves for the next 8 years? You know what I'm saying? Like, is this something where that requires a charter change today because we're focusing on youth, whereas that would normally be an APS tax base initiative squarely in their purview? Do you see what I'm saying? Like sustainability. I do want to be a green city. So, you know, will our next mayor be as pro-green as I am? Do you see what I mean? So what I'm saying is I'm here today to make sure that I'm listening, and I was listening on Facebook, you know, because y'all are doing a great job, communications, of making sure that we can listen wherever we are. So thank you for that. I am here to make sure that we're not making feel-good decisions for right now, for the city. It needs to make sense to me. So just know that my ears are open for that, and not just what's happening today and right now. Okay?
No, I greatly appreciated that.
Okay.
Councilmember Overstreet. And to state for the record, yes, we do have an issue. I do want to be cognizant of the fact that that Atlanta feels at times that our council feels at times that it's had mission creep because of the fact that we aren't always met with as much openness from our counties, and oftentimes we often have been put in situations to pick up the slack because we do have a mental health crisis right now. We do have an opioid crisis, and we do have those things. And yes, Health and Human Services should not fall under the city of Atlanta. That is a county responsibility. So I completely understand all of that. And I also understand wanting to plan for the long term rather than just now. And I also wanted to give Mr. Council President an opportunity to speak as well. Go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate the nature of this conversation. I think it's always good to be thinking about how we're structured. You know, this idea first came up actually during the campaign for City Council President. Former council member Natalie Archibong, actually, we were asked in a session if we were to change one thing about committee structure, what would it be? And her immediate response was actually separating CD and HS. It used to be that way, she said, and there was she felt like that there was a lot of logic to thinking through it. So actually that's when this was first planted, this particular issue was first planted in my head, was back during the campaign. A few things I was listening to, thanks to technology, a few things that come to mind just for clarity. Right now, if you think about the 7 standing committees and 7 members each, you have 49 seats that council members sit on. If you think about the 15 council members each having 3 committee assignments, that's 45 seats. So currently 4 council members have 4 committees, and the other 11 council members have 3 committees. If this were to be implemented and you still staffed every committee with 7 members, basically then you would have to have 11 of the 15 serving on 4 committees and 4 of the 15 only serving on 3 committees. But as was alluded to, you could potentially have some committees with only 5 members. That has been a discussion that some members have had with me. That question's been raised before. I think it comes down to really around quorum, because you do need quorum to have things happen. And so you would have to be quite thoughtful about which committees you would only have 5, because then you really would have to have attendance to move things through. So I think there is some flexibility. There's obviously flexibility in the code, as Ms. Robinson alluded to. I think that there's also just the notion of how much do we think it will impact the actual operations if we went from 7 to 5, and vice versa, as Councilmember Amos said, how much would it impact operations if we went from 7 to 8 committees? But this used to be split. Finance exec used to be split. There are all those that have long names are all committees that used to be 2 committees and are now 1 committee. I think Councilmember Overstreet raises the right question, and that is to think about in the long term how we're structuring our committees and whether or not we're structuring for the future. And Councilmember Amos made a similar kind of point. when I think about city government and it's specifically Atlanta city government's role, Atlanta city government is being asked to take a lot of policy issues that aren't necessarily in our charter, primarily because the state has stepped away from a lot of its funding and or just its purview, right? You could argue that housing actually is not in the charter. You could argue it because it's not in the charter. But you argue that we have to do it because the other entities, especially the state, haven't actually stepped in as strongly as the housing issue requires. And so when I think about this potential move and I think about the kinds of things in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years that we're likely to see, I think housing issues are going to only increase. I think that human services broadly are only going to increase. I think unhoused issues are only going to be similar, if not increased. And I think generally we're going to see the scope of city government potentially increase in the areas around programming, right? Even when we see the federal government and the federal government's role and what it's been funding, a lot of the block grants and those types of things, we continue to see that money flow down to states from federal government, not the federal government doing it, but sending block grants, sending other kinds of grants down to not only states, but down to municipalities. And I think we're going to continue to see that direct funding mechanism from Fed to cities continue and grow. And so from my perspective, when I think about, from my unique role and I look at the committee work, I think about putting council members in positions where they can become experts. In essence, putting each of you in a position where you can say, I know a lot about what's going on with housing, with parks, with the Beltline, with zoning, right? So that when there's a question, we have a group of council members who in essence can say, no, we do with this week in and week out. We've seen a lot of it. We have a lot of depth of expertise. And other council members in the public can, in essence, depend on their judgment, right? If they say this is a great idea, you say, well, the zoning committee knows it because the zoning committee does a lot of it. CDHS knows it because they do a lot of it. And I think my concern is not the necessarily to Chair Dozier's point, not necessarily the legislative burden, but it actually is all those presentations that I'm most worried about. I think that that's really important, and that's a huge information, right? Even Invest Atlanta's presentation alone has 4 or 5 different big meaty topics in it each time. And if you've got Invest Atlanta presenting and Parks presenting and ACVB presenting, that's a whole lot of data, right, to try to digest for the public, for the council, to make sure that we say we know we're poking at all the right questions and we know that we're doing our oversight role. And so the combination of where I see sort of the scope of the city expanding, a lot in CDHS, sustainability, I think, too, is going to be a huge expansion. And the question that Chair Winston raises is the right one, is where's the line between sustainability from a utilities perspective and here? I think no matter what, we need to put sustainability more explicitly in our duties of committees, wherever it's decided to go. I think that needs to be done because I think we need to showcase that. But I think for CDHS specifically, I just see that there is a broadening requirement on this particular committee around topics and expertise. There's a broadening set of dollars and programs that I think are going to continue to come. And the question simply is, would it be easier to manage, given all of the different puts and takes, would it be easier to manage by splitting it into 2 so you'd have more defined areas of expertise around community development and around the human factors, or do you want to continue to put it all together? And to me, that's the fundamental question. But I do see that the scope, if not the burden of topics, is going to continue to grow when you look at this particular committee. And then just the other thing I'd say to the discussion that happened, are there other things outside that we really would want somebody from council sitting on, especially as the scope increases? And so maybe it's 4 today going to 5, but really should it be 8? And would this give us a little more, instead of saying, hey, it's got to be CDHS and we can't put CDHS's chair on a 5th, a 6th, the 7th commission. But if you step back and said, oh, you had 2 committees, you've got 2 chairs now in this purview, and each of them on 3 or 4 could actually expand council's reach out onto those formal boards, because I do think it gives you a little bit more reach when it comes to time of those chairs. But to me, I just continue to see scope in these arenas growing, and I think that it's a thoughtful discussion to have right now.
Thank you so much. That gives us a lot to think about. Please.
Okay, in listening to President Shipman and everyone actually, I also want us to think about if we're so okay increasing our scope without our tax base increasing. How does that? The math ain't mathing. How does that add up? You know, what do we do about making sure that we increase our tax base to accommodate the extra loads that we're willing to take on? Like we can't think of this as, okay, let's just agree to do more. Like, when do we time out? When is that bucket so full that we can't continue to take on other scopes from other tax bases? Because they're going to still be getting those dollars to do what they're supposed to be doing. So I have to understand better, how are we going to be fine increasing our scope, hoping that we get those federal dollars, and just moving about doing anything that's necessary to make this city better. Whether we're actually going to eradicate anything or not, we just want to do it. I want to make sure that we're not just looking at a problem and saying, okay, we can take care of it, because our money, our funding and our tax base is set right now. And we can take on a whole lot more if we want to, but it'll be less for the things that we actually have to do. Trash has to be picked up. We have to make sure that we're paying all of the employees the right way. Every time we use money to do something else or broadening scopes, we're making sure that our employees aren't getting those raises that they deserve. We're making sure that we're cutting back on picking up tree trimmings on a Thursday. You know, those are the things that I think we need to do. We're making sure that we're not filling in potholes as fast as we should, and that only half a Cascade is paid right now. Like, those are the things that we're making sure that we're not going to be doing well because we're taking on extra scope. That's just where I am with it.
No,
I've done 4 committees before. We did it for a couple of years. Didn't mind. That's the truth. It wasn't that big a deal. So I don't think it's the extra day that's a problem for me, because this is my full-time job. I just want to make sure that we are spending taxpayer dollars correctly, and that it makes sense, and that it's truly squarely in our purview, and something that we're going to commit to do for the long haul. It's got to make sense, not just for today. So that's all I'm saying. It really is about funding for me, and using our tax base, and the fact that we don't have the largest tax base of the city, in this area. Yet, I'd say that we're the best well-oiled machine that gets more work done than most, and so we don't mind taking on the burden. But where is that line? Like, what don't we do?
Understood.
Yeah. Okay.
I also think you've made an excellent argument for density. So, no, that's very valid in terms of the tax base. I think, one, I agree. I think one of the biggest complaints has been, a city's job is pick up trash, fill potholes, ensure all that is done. And obviously, that is something we want to make sure that we're doing effectively, and to your point, not taking away from if we're expanding our scope. I will say that I do believe, though, we understand that in the next 18 years, according to the Atlanta Regional Commission and our previous Commissioner of Planning, that we do know that we're going to bring in more than 900,000 people. That is going to happen. That is our projected growth. And so, to your point, we are steadily growing. We are an evolving city. And I think, to the point of what's right for today, I specifically picked thought of youth development and sustainability because the youth should, I think that should, even if mayors after Mayor Dickens don't want to focus on that, I think it's important that the council that is in committees, because of the fact that no matter if it's someone's focus or not, the youth is such a critical piece of the growth of a city, of the way crime is affected, of the way we react to issues, because that is the foundation. They are the foundation of everything. And so it should always be, to me, is even a stronger reason to fold it in, because we need to ensure that that is always a topic of conversation, no matter who the mayor is. And I'm appreciative that we have a mayor that is so focused on it now. And then in terms of the sustainability piece, I think there has been a time, I think it's always been, for the longest period of time, we thought of sustainability, green space is not, it hasn't been a top priority. It's something that we can focus on, and it's like one of those novel things that we really, really enjoy and is important. But now Georgia's being hit by hurricanes. We're beginning to suffer the extreme rainfall. 100-year storms are happening multiple times in a summer. We have, flooding increases, all of these things that are occurring. It's going to be, temperatures hit the hundreds, and it's August and almost September. Those are the reason I'm so focused on that, is because it's going to become more of a critical part of our life and part of safety and infrastructure. And in addition, with rising temperatures and everything else, the city is more at risk of heat-related deaths. And based on the heat vulnerability study that we did, it is estimated that 3%, God forbid, a blackout or something were to occur in an extreme weather-related incident, we estimate that 3% of the city would need to go to the hospital. And that does not sound like a lot, but that's about 15 to 20,000 people. And I want to remind everyone that we only currently have 2,000 ED beds in the city right now. So to me, that also means that we are one, bless you, that we are one weather-related incident away from a potential collapse of our healthcare system. And again, while the healthcare is on us, that is also on the state and counties, and we need to keep that pressure up. But that is something I think of when I think in terms of sustainability and resilience, and why it should be such a critical part of the city moving forward. But Councilmember Dozier, I also wanted to come back to you after what you've heard both Council President and Councilmember Overstreet say. Did you have any thoughts about all the points that they have brought up?
Just one thought that I did think about, not explicitly tied to the commentary, but something that I wonder if it would maybe add some color. But I don't know if the city code or the charter speaks to an opportunity to have a subcommittee structure that could help alleviate some of the burden, the scope burden that we were discussing with regards to CDHS directly. So I'm curious if there's an opportunity for that to help alleviate some of that concentration of stuff that comes to the committee.
Council President, you looked like you had something you wanted to add. Oh, go ahead.
So the code actually does contemplate that subcommittees created by standing committees could be formed. We heretofore, I don't believe, have done that, but it is something that is contemplated. There's no instruction given, but there's a reference to subcommittees created by a standing committee in the code under the division concerning standing committees. So it's certainly contemplated.
And just to add some context, the thinking there is, rather than split the CDHS committee out completely, having certain members of that larger body meet to discuss on the very specific issues related to human services, related to community development, and that would, granted that was said before, I don't think we've ever done it before, so how this would look or feel leaves a lot to be desired or determined, but I recognize that it helps with efficiency at the state level, at the federal level, when you have these committees overseeing a lot of different things that are under their purview. So just food for thought. And I didn't realize that was contemplated in the code, but Just wanted to add that as maybe worth considering as a solution to get us to the next steps.
Greatly appreciate that. Thank you. Council President.
Yeah, I want to jump on the bandwagon that Councilmember Overstreet was on, and she and I have both had this conversation in Finance Exec, because as we've gone through the budget process, the issue of city scope of services and requirements and issues are questions that we've both asked during finance budget sessions to say, hey, the budget's growing in these ways and we're doing these things that, that the city didn't used to do, and how do we think about the tax base? And so I think this is a really important point that we also that we should continue in the finance exec side of things when we look at the budget and when the administration brings the budget over, or when we make amendments to the budget, to think about, long term, is this sustainable? I guess the other piece, just as it relates to this conversation, is, my view is that the more expertise you have, the better you are able to poke at certain questions. And so if you just look at CDHS and related to sort of the tax base or the future tax base, you have economic development, Department of Labor and Workforce Development, ACVB, which is a huge economic driver for the city.
And Council President, will you state what that acronym stands for?
Oh, Atlanta Convention and Visitors Bureau, sorry. The Department of Grants, the film and entertainment, all of that industry fits under CDHS, and impact fees. Those are all, basically revenue generators or precursors for revenue for the city. And so I think the question that I have is, as currently structured, do we believe that CDHS can get knee deep, hands deep in all of those things for better oversight? Or do we think by having all of those things together, you actually don't get as good insight, don't get as good oversight, and don't get to these questions? I guess I see the expansion of the scope of the city services as not being driven by the committees or even by council as much as administrations that have come in and said, I want to add something, I want to add something, I want to add something. And so the question that I have is, how can council position itself and organize itself to have the best oversight role to say, hey, wait a minute, how are we going to pay for this? Should this be Fulton County? Should this be the state, et cetera? And is that better? And it's a general question. Do we have enough expertise, time, and bandwidth to go knee deep into all of these various issues? And that's the question, right? And so to me, I think you've got a balance between folding them together because they relate to each other and pulling things apart because they've become so big that you actually need some more time to develop, to go into development fees, film and TV, economic development, ACVB, whatever the case may be. And so again, it's the answer isn't necessarily clear, but I think that the scope, we limit scope creep best by having enough time to ask really, really deep questions as those proposals come forward or as they're administrated. And so the question is, do we have enough time as council? Do we have enough do we have enough depth in order to get to those things? Instead of saying, 15 minutes are up, we've got to move on to the next thing. We've got 4 things today, so we're just going to let that go. Instead of saying, no, we've got plenty of time. And I think, we've seen in some other issues like transportation, taking some time to be able to go knee deep on things has yielded some good results. And so I think, that's the question for all of the committees, but especially for CDHS, where you've got a lot of very significant issues that I think are going to continue to need attention from council.
Yes, I believe, you go ahead and add, I think Councilmember Amos wanted to go, and then I'll have you.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
going to add, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but just wanted to add, I'm one of the lucky ones that won the committee lottery. I sit on 4. Thank you, Council President. But, I think
You said you were open to it when we
Yes,
spoke.
I was.
So I just want that noted for the record.
And I still am and I think I'm gonna try to drive the point home is that I think the big question is, is it too much of a burden for us to be able to become subject matter experts in all of the information that we are getting from that committee? And personally, I don't feel like it is. I feel like there is enough time, and I feel like there's so much cohesion between the different parts and elements of CDHS that it makes sense to keep those elements there. And I don't feel like I'm lacking in being able to be more knowledgeable in the different elements of that committee because it does have so many parts. I just truly feel like those parts all kind of fit together, and I think it's something that you know. I think the way my committees are structured gives me enough time to be able to dive in and become more of an expert on those. So I just wanted to add that 2 cents based on what Council President was saying about, you know, big question is, do we have enough time to be able to become subject matter experts in the information that we're being able to receive?
Thank you, Councilmember Winston. Vice Chair Amos?
You know, listening to everything, I agree with a lot. I do think the city has taken on a lot of responsibility of our other elected cousins who should be doing things that fit inside of their mission and their charter, in which they're not. It is up to the next, sometimes up to the administration, but really all of this is guided by the needs of the people when it comes down to it, whether it's in our charter or not. I think the extra committees will do 2 things: allow us to actually service the people of the city and their needs, but more so importantly, educate them about the other people that they vote for that, you know, really should be addressing these concerns. So I don't know if it's legally possible through the charter, but it's for us to do a trial run through the rules of council, add these committees to CDHS, structure CDHS in which, not as far as in a time frame, but the first part of the meeting we're doing CD, second part human services, third part on youth and sustainability. Structure it like that, probably for a year's time, to see what it looks like, to see if we need it or if we don't need it. I don't know if that's possible. And then the other piece to help my chairman out, for all of the boards that he sit on, maybe we can begin to talk to those people who controls those boards and ask, does it specifically say the chair of CDHS or his or her designee or vice chair? That way it helps you out. The chair is just not always going to these other committees. But I don't know if it's a way for us, because even if we do a subcommittee, it's still another committee. So I don't know if it's a way to try it out to see that we can put these in CDHS, you know, not through the code, but through rules of council to see if it works. And if it works, then we look at it. If it doesn't work, then we get out of the business. I don't know.
Ms. Robinson, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, I actually think that at the pleasure of the chair and of the committee structure within the committee could be altered in a fashion as described by Councilmember Amos. I think that, you know, the flow, the agenda, and so forth of the committee is at the committee's pleasure. And if you wanted to, you know, break it up by subject matter or configure some of the scheduling in that way, that would be possible and would not take, if any, very little legislative action in order to accomplish. I would, of course, reserve the right to determine whether or not any pieces of the code would need to be updated, but I do believe it's mostly just something that would be under the committee's purview.
Thank you for that. I do want to say, though, for the record, if everyone feels that that we have enough time, I'm going to be asking a lot more questions. And I want, like, you know, like I'm gonna have a list of like 100 of them, and I'm gonna really dive deep. I wanted to thank my colleagues so much for taking the time. I know we've hit a lot of topics. I think it's actually been a really informative work session. I've learned a lot sitting here, and I'm very, very, very appreciative that y'all came today and gave your time. And I wanted to, before we open up comments to the public, I wanted to ask if anyone had anything else they wanted to add or talk. Ms. Robinson, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, thank you.
Oh, there is one thing, Council President, that's something that came up before you joined us was the conversation of having to flesh out the committee week. I believe that would be, however we set the agenda, would be in part dictated by the Council President, correct? Is that something you wanted to weigh in on?
Sure, I can weigh on it briefly. Obviously, the way that we do committee week now is that 6 of the 7 committees meet during the committee week, and then COC meets obviously the morning of. I think the first question that I would ask if you had an additional 8th committee is, does it make sense for any of the committees to also move to council day? Because that's logistically the easiest day, right, to move it to. And if not, then I think you probably would be looking at adding a 4th day during committee week. Just 3 on the same day would be very difficult. 2 makes sense. So I think that your 2 options logistically in my mind, though I'd want to talk to council staff, would be either the council Monday, so like COC, so have a second one there, or to add a Thursday council committee meeting during committee week. I think those are your 2 obvious logistical options that would work best.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I want to say before we move into public comment, in terms of next steps, I would, if it is okay with my colleagues, would like to to Councilmember Amos's point, flesh out some thoughts on what a committee report would look like for youth development, the idea of how we could get more into sustainability, and talk to the CUC chair, Councilmember Winston, about that. And then I would like to then send it to you all and get thoughts on what you all think, if everyone is open to that. Mr. Evans. Are we ready to move into public comment?
No one has signed up for public comment.
No one has? Nobody? Mr. Kessler, not even you? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought. No one like to speak? Okay. Okay. Thank you then. I appreciate everybody for coming in today. Thank you to my colleagues for their time. Thank you to the staff. And we stand adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.